Hello, and welcome to 10 for 10, 10th News, your weekly dose of 10th Amendment news in 10 minutes or so from the 10th Amendment Center. Today is January 22nd, 2013. My name is Michael Bolden, and thank you for tuning in. This week's episode is made possible in part by the 10th Amendment Center membership program. Proudly wear your 10ther label with pride and become a card-carrying member of the TSA. Get all the details at members.10thamendmentcenter.com. And now the news. The resistance to so-called federal gun laws continues to grow, with states such as Texas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Arizona also considering nullification of these federal acts. The current count is already at 11. Oklahoma's Senate Bill 548, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, is among the strongest in the country. It states in part, quote, "Federal acts, laws, orders, rules, regulations, bans, or registration requirements regarding firearms constitute an infringement on the individual right, are not authorized by the Constitution, and are hereby declared to be invalid in the state of Oklahoma, shall not be recognized by this state, are specifically rejected by this state, and shall be considered null and void and of no effect in this state." End quote. The legislation also provides for criminal penalties for federal agents who try to enforce unconstitutional gun laws, rules, regulations, orders, and the like. It continues, quote, "Any official, agent, or employee of the United States government, or any employee of a corporation providing services to the United States government that enforces or attempts to enforce an act, order, law, statute, rule, or regulation of the government of the United States in violation of this act shall be guilty of a felony, and upon conviction shall be punished by imprisonment in the custody of the Department of Corrections not to exceed 5 years, or by a fine not exceeding $5,000, or by both such fine and imprisonment." 10th Amendment Center National Communications Director Mike Meharry, and author of the new book, Our Last Hope, summed up much of the sentiment behind such bills around the country. He said, "When you've got people like Feinstein talking about major bans, and Biden telling us that all they need is an executive order, you know these people are willing to go all the way. So it's good to see these other folks in Oklahoma and other states go all the way as well, in support of the Second Amendment, that is, without any ifs, ands, or buts. The feds have absolutely zero constitutional authority to make any laws over your firearms, period." The Second Amendment was not created to give the right to keep and bear arms to the people. The founders acknowledged that the people already had those rights. The Second Amendment was intended to protect them by keeping the government, the federal government primarily, off their backs. Robert Nadelson writes in his book, The Original Constitution, quote, "The Second Amendment served purposes besides buttressing the natural right of self-defense and the reserved power of armed resistance. By guaranteeing continuation of the state militias, it strengthened state power in the state-federal balance. By protecting the militia, the Second Amendment promoted citizen involvement in government military affairs." And he continued, "The purpose of the Second Amendment suggests that the word arms should be interpreted rather broadly to include a range of military and self-defense weapons." That's how Nadelson put it in his book, The Original Constitution. You can track the status of Second Amendment preservation bills around the country at tracking.10thamendmentcenter.com. To get model legislation for introduction in your state or local community, visit 10thamendmentcenter.com/Second Amendment Preservation. While a number of states are currently considering legislation to nullify federal gun laws, rules, acts, orders, and regulations, and various sheriffs around the country are issuing notice that they will not enforce any such federal laws, a new grassroots undercurrent could be building to support those efforts. Local governments nullifying unconstitutional federal acts in violation of the Second Amendment. Last week, Beaufort County, North Carolina, became the first in the country to do so. The Board of Commissioners passed a nullification resolution in support of the Second Amendment. The vote was unanimous. The resolution reads, in part, quote, "The Beaufort County Board of Commissioners calls upon the Governor and the General Assembly of the State of North Carolina to immediately pass an act to nullify the implementation within the State of North Carolina of any federal law, executive order, or regulations restricting the right to keep and bear arms." It continues and makes clear that the county will play no supporting role to the federal government in attacks on the Second Amendment. Be it further resolved, the county manager be directed to see that no county paid staff participate in nor allow any county resources be used in the implementation of any federal law, executive order, or executive directive that infringe on the right to keep and bear arms. Enthusiasm from the community was high. Representatives from the North Carolina 10th Amendment Center reported that the room was packed, and it was so full it was to the point that the crowd was overflowing out into the hall. 2 local TV stations were on hand to report as well. In our next story, in Texas, Round 2 versus the TSA is underway. In the State House, Representative David Simpson has introduced House Bill 80, and in the Senate, Senator Patrick has introduced Senate Bill 20. This piece of legislation reads, quote, "A person who is a public servant commits an offense if the person, while acting under the color of the person's office or employment, A, intentionally subjects another person to mistreatment or to arrest, detention, search, seizure, dispossession, assessment, or lien, B, intentionally denies or impedes another person in the exercise or enjoyment of any right, privilege, power, or immunity, knowing the actor's conduct is unlawful, or C, intentionally subjects another person to sexual harassment, will be subject to prosecution if the defendant was at the time of the alleged offense acting under the color of federal law." And in closing today, both Washington State and Oklahoma are now considering legislation to nullify the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. In Washington, 10 representatives, led by Representative Matt Shea, introduced House Bill 1168, that's HB 1168, known as the Washington State Healthcare Freedom Act of 2013. The bill would protect people there from any attempt to force them into any healthcare system, guaranteeing the right to control their own healthcare decisions. The bill states, in part, "A law or rule pertaining to healthcare shall not directly or indirectly compel any person, employer, or healthcare provider to participate in any healthcare system." Provisions in the bill also protect the right of healthcare providers to accept direct payment and block any law that would prohibit the purchase of private health insurance. The legislation concludes with a provision nullifying any federal act in conflict with provisions of the bill, based on the fact that no constitutional authority has been delegated to the federal government to administer a health care system. The bill continues. It says, quote, "Any federal law, rule, order, or other act by the federal government violating the provisions of this section is hereby declared to be invalid in this state, is not recognized by and is specifically rejected by this state, and is considered as null and void and of no effect in this state." Track the status of similar legislation in states around the country at tracking.10thamendmentcenter.com. Get model legislation ready for introduction in your state at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Obamacare. And that covers our report here today on 10 for 10, 10th News. Get 10 minutes or so of 10th Amendment news every week from the 10th Amendment Center. Watch 10th News live online at news.10thamendmentcenter.com, and also view all our archive shows at that same link, news.10thamendmentcenter.com. My name is Michael Bolden. Thanks again for tuning in.